Hey guys, today I'm going to yell my opinion loudly on the internet. There are no downsides whatsoever. So these are my predictions of the next general election in the UK. It's basically guaranteed to be wrong, unless there are somehow seven elections in the next 3 years. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is useless, but whatever. Okay, so this is a fairly unlikely scenario. Realistically, we would have seen this if there was an election in February or January when the Tories were polling at like the mid-50s and Labour just decided to yeet their electability out of the window. Anyways, the scenario is as follows. So this is fairly obvious, but at this point the economy is out of the shitter and there are any massively devastating short-term and long-term effects of Brexit. I mean, long-term effects don't really matter in this case, but you know. And the investments in the economy have succeeded. So like the Keynesian measures that Johnson's been producing, those work, which they largely have been working. So I mean that's one accurate part of this scenario. Also, issues like the Black Lives Matter protests and race relations start re-entering center stage around the election, emphasizing a disconnect between the Labour Party and their traditional base, letting Boris kind of sweep the northern seats again, and possibly gain seats like Wirral West. And issues like investment in green investment infrastructure, having like little differences between Labour, like pedantic differences between Labour and the Tories, even further emphasize race relations and immigration as key parts of the campaign, which should undoubtedly help the Conservatives in the North. Obviously, it would also hurt them in London, but who cares about London? Another note is that I would think the only way Boris is to get like this type of win is without any sort of major concessions to the EU. I made these in like mid-December, so I made this one in mid-December. So there aren't like any major concessions to the EU, which I think is probably correct, to be fair. I think the scenario is fairly unlikely. Like, this is basically contingent on the handling of COVID just being completely forgotten and the economy not only recovering after Brexit, but booming. I think that realistically, especially with Biden blocking off a US trade deal, or mostly blocking off a US trade deal, this scenario is the least likely of them. Coming in at like 5%. No, I'm probably gonna change that later on. Don't quote me on that. So yeah, the next scenario is obviously reminiscent of 2015. It's probably more likely, probably not the most likely scenario. I think that realistically, a moderate conservative government versus a moderate Labour opposition turns out to be something like this, without like any sort of fiascos or anything. So this scenario is basically based around the idea of Boris being broadly but not strongly disliked, and the Labour Party somewhat failing to capture more socially conservative, air quotes here, traditional Labour voters in the Midlands. This scenario is most likely dominated by a somewhat stagnant and slow recovery from COVID and Boris making a last-minute trade deal with the EU that makes concessions disliked by his Brexit base but not strongly enough disliked so that they actually make a difference about it. Concessions from negotiations lead to Farage forming a party in early 2021, which of course he already has. If you don't know, Farage has made his own like Reform Party. I mean, not made, but like changed the Brexit Party's name to the Reform Party. So yeah, effectively made, but early 2021 to fight for Boris's working class base, or somewhat working class base, and this right-wing party captures something in the high single digits of support, like 7-8%, proving to be somewhat successful, though not enough to actually do anything. With possibly getting a seat in Hartlepool or Thurrock or whatever. The right-wing trouble is met with some middling and somewhat uninspired leadership from Starmer and from Labour, which leads to some vote splitting and gains for the Green Party, and the Green Party rising to their highest ever vote total. I mean, again, not enough to make any sort of difference, because it's the Green Party here, like, their highest vote total ever is like 6%, but nothing actually matters here. Which is kind of some post-left commentary. I don't know, I completely changed my voice there, but I did, and you're gonna have to live with that for the rest of the video. This combination of basically lack of inspiration from either major parties leads to lower turnout in the election, especially amongst younger voters. So essentially, on either side of the divide, you have a relatively extreme party on the flank of an uninspired and centrist major party. This divide, however, seemingly favors the conservatives in this scenario with their slight economic progress and message of moderate economic policies combined with standard conservative talking points of law and order in the wake of riots that come in early 2024 or something like that. Push them just over the edge of electoral majority, ready to claim 2 decades in government. Fucking bastards. In Scotland and Wales, both nationalist parties receive small bumps, but not nearly as much of a bump I was expecting from the SNP in the early days of Boris Johnson's premiership. So, the SNP gained a few seats, but not as much as they would in a normal scenario, essentially. So this is the 4th scenario. Alright, so this is one of the more likely scenarios, in my opinion. I think that a Johnson government, largely seen as incompetent and unable to retain some seats that got them their landslide majority in 2019, will be forced to come back with a greatly reduced majority, or a minority, which is what I'm proposing here. I don't know why I put greatly reduced majority. In this scenario, the economy doesn't fully recover from the financial shock of COVID, followed immediately by a harder Brexit that has bad short-term economic impact on the economy, with banks largely abandoning London as their major hub for European Union for EU operations, with areas like Dublin, Paris, and Frankfurt taking most of the jobs. However, Nigel Farage still makes his own political party to challenge a severe coronavirus lockdown restriction imposed at the beginning of a third wave of the virus in late February 2021, not 2020, sorry. This, along with the opposition from the Labour Party that has been tailored to be broadly inoffensive to the entirety of the nation, allows the Conservatives to lose a large amount of their seats. The attacks from the right and the left aren't so much on policy as they are on competence, with nearly all parties making the handling of coronavirus, Brexit, and the economic fallout of both as a proving of broad incompetence from the Conservative government, with Farage criticizing their large and irresponsible spending as well as punitive lockdown measures. But Labour are boring and uninspiring, with their best lines being criticizing any perceived incompetence from the Johnson administration, but not actually being able to move the public's opinions on the issues significantly. Really just trying to change Labour with a general centre-right attitude of the British public after 14 years of conservation. So generally, the Conservatives get a backlash from their incompetence, but their policies are still marginally popular. This incompetence also puts unionism in the shitter in Northern Ireland and Scotland, and stokes separatism in Wales. So basically, Boris is such a bumbling idiot that everyone wants to leave England and get some Labour gains in England, but nobody actually cares enough to change their views on economic or social policies. So this is a relatively possible scenario, at least in my opinion. So this scenario can basically be surmised that nobody likes anybody and everybody's more extreme. This is a pretty easy thing to think up. An incompetent Johnson administration botching vaccine deliveries and having to put the UK through another lockdown extends the economic fallout of a hard Brexit. Also, assuming there's no agreement reached with the finance bros of London, we can expect some of those twats to rally behind the Lib Dems. Also, Labour manages to completely isolate socialists by revoking Corbyn's whip, and Corbyn furthers the divide between moderate and socialists by making a leftist party, probably led by Corbyn or Long Bailey. Adding on to this, Lib Dems are somewhat able to surge in support in the South, with their Orange Book leaders hammering of the Johnson administration on shit like the lorry queues in Kent and immigrants' rights. Starmer is again broadly uninspiring and unable to fend off any of the attacks from the left, and in a poor attempt to appeal to socialist/green voters or demotivated young people, he adapts to a slightly more leftist manifesto, which slightly boosts his support in London and more socialist areas, but undercuts him in turnout in more centrist areas, with most of them voting for the liberal Democrats. Nationalists have a fucking field day with this dumpster fire and capitalize on the destabilized Westminster to make a case for devolved governments and or independence. We've yet to talk about the right wing in this scenario, which is a shame, so let's do it. So Farage has a field day with this. He's able to position himself as sort of a paleo-libertarian, criticizing Johnson's response to COVID and Boris's spending in one foul swoop, and of course criticizes Boris's Brexit for not being Brexity enough, and not deporting enough immigrants, obviously. Also, if Boris focuses too much on the environment, it opens up the ability for Farage to criticizing him for abandoning British cargo and industry. Basically, we have a kind of 2015 on steroids, or 2010 on steroids, I would probably say. With the Lib Dems taking the center, Labour taking the center left and left, the DSP taking the far left, Tories taking the center right and right, Farage taking the far right, Nationalists continuing the proud tradition of fucking Labour out of the government. So this is really everyone losing, even more than the scenario where everyone lost in. I think this is also probably one of the more likely scenarios. So I don't think that anyone on the left is really going to start another political party in this scenario. That may go horribly out of date soon, but I don't think the rift is that big between the center and the left. If Corbyn and the SCG or Labour MPs under literally all of the other centrist leaders, I doubt that they'll be standing up now, even if they may have support than they had under other leaders. I do think, however, that the type of politics that Keir Starmer likes to play is one that may bleed some Corbynite votes to the Greens, so they'll do well for themselves. Probably reaching somewhere around 5% of the vote, maybe 4%, 6%, I don't know. On the right, I think that the continuation of the Brexit party is probably a relatively popular party, becoming a refuge for the libertarians, hard right, and those who think Boris is a bumbling idiot, but don't think his policies are bumbling or idiotic. I don't know how his policies would be bumbling, but they just are, you know? They just, like, manifest minds and just, like, bumble off. That's what they do. I think that generally the Brexit party's continuation in the scenario, which is some like high single digits, and like literally every other one of Farage's party strikes a chord with the east of England and the Midlands. The Conservatives once again prove themselves to be bitterly incompetent, but unlike 2017 when they were rapidly losing ground, they start off in a fairly bad position and maintain that position throughout the campaign, maybe losing a couple dozen seats in the fundamental dynamics of the campaign couldn't really give less of a shit whether Boris hides in a fridge or not. So ostensibly this is the US presidential election again in the UK. It's a repudiation of Boris, to a small extent Boris and Brexit populism, but nothing like 97 or 79. Boris bumbles his way out of government, but doesn't take Brexit style populism with him. Let's take a look at some of the causes of this though. The first and the most obvious is the short-term effects of Brexit, causing a recession in the UK, and with Biden cock-blocking any sort of deal with the UK has a relatively high unemployment rate and sees itself in a slightly better off position than it was in 2010. Labour has also managed to strangle the socialists into voting for them, mostly with appeasement at their party conferences and some more moderately leftist views populating their manifesto and driving up turnout amongst the youths. So essentially, Labour aren't completely shit, and the Conservatives are. Also, the Lib Dems are competent and are able to siphon centrist votes from the Conservatives and Labour, and are able to craft a space for themselves within British politics. At least for now. Also, Boris bad EU good is a pretty popular view in a timeline where Boris causes a recession by leaving the EU and bungling COVID. And now, to keep the proud tradition of yelling at people you mostly agree with, the SNP and Plaid Cymru see a boost in their support for the general incompetence of the Tories and lack of enthusiasm from the major parties, or like not complete lack of it, but you know, like general lack of enthusiasm. I don't mean like in the other scenario. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. In lack of enthusiasm from the main parties, essentially with more overtly populist messaging from the SNP and Plaid Cymru, they'd both be able to gain quite a lot of ground in their respective countries, constituent countries. Especially if they attack Labour on their vote on the Brexit deal and attacking unionism by painting independence as the only way to join the EU. So really the situation boils down to this. Conservatives are incompetent and Brexit causes a recession. Labour are completely inept and are able to keep some of the socialists in their party. The Lib Dems are able to carve a corner for themselves by doing the political equivalent of pointing and laughing at the village idiots. Nationalists and Farage are able to tap into some populist resentment in their respective constituents' countries. I think that this is a somewhat unrealistic scenario. The 2019 election broke Labour in a way that can't really be undone in one election. Even in the best case scenario that's realistic, I think Labour have fundamentally fucked themselves out of a majority for this election, but I think that it's incredibly unlikely that the Tories are so fucking incompetent that Labour are able to gain 124 seats, but it's bumbling Boris. It's not impossible, but it's not likely. But with that said, here's a scenario where this happens. Essentially, Boris just completely fucks everything up. He completely mismanages the handling of the coronavirus, with cases rising even after another lockdown, which opens up general criticism from opposition and even more particularly criticism from Farage's Reform Party, saying that Boris should have never brought the UK into another lockdown. Boris also completely fucks over the economy with his hard Brexit, and the financial sector abandons London and manufacturing plants, yeet the north even more than they did before. Essentially, the economy is completely fucked by Brexit, at least in the short term, and we get a recession slightly worse than 2008, with the financial sector in London being particularly badly affected by this recession. And Starmer is able to do the seemingly impossible by keeping centre in British politics, whilst also be able to, if not inspire, then largely keep the socialist vote with the Labour Party and keep Labour united in this election. Another thing that's key to this scenario is Farage fucking over the Tories. Without at least some vote splitting between Farage's party and the Tories, I think it's fairly unlikely that Labour gets any sort of majority in the Commons. Even with a small one, I think they're going to have Farage taking a significant chunk of the Tories, more working class voters in the North and Midlands, and letting Labour into power, essentially. I also think that Liberal Democrats would rise with Labour, since in this scenario, a type of centrist, pro-EU, Boris bad, EU good mentality is a pretty obviously popular one here. Also, I feel like whenever Labour makes gains in this in elections, at least in modern politics, the Lib Dems tend to gain seats, since anti-conservatism tends to benefit them fucking over the Tories in the South, in some parts of London, them being the Liberal Democrats in this scenario. I don't think Labour is gonna win the South. Red Kent. I also think that the Scottish Nationalists are essentially in the same position as they are now, with moderate gains and a small majority voting for the SNP, especially with continued incompetence from the Tories and a recession that's blamed on the Tories. The Tories won't be able to do shit in Scotland. Ain't nobody gonna save the Scottish Tories from themselves. This is a substantial rejection of Boris and Brexit-style populism if it happens. It's not only an endorsement of the left, it's more an acceptance of the moderate left in the face of the idiotic right. Not to say that the right is completely idiotic, I'm just saying that this right is idiotic. I think that a slightly rousing Starmer and Farage are able to get are going to be arbiters as to whether Boris is in or not in. If Farage wins a significant amount of votes, it weathers all of the votes the Conservatives have in the North and Midlands, and vote splits enough to get some Labour gains. And if Starmer's able to get up the vote and to keep the left and take some of the centre from Boris, then he withers away some of Boris's support everywhere, essentially. But particularly in London and the North. So essentially, Starmer keeps centre, but is able to not take a massive shit on the socialists, whilst Farage is a racist and gets like 50% of the racist vote for him. I also think that there's going to be significant rifts in the Tories, especially because of the COVID response, and I think the rift is in two places. It's firstly in the lockdowns and the restrictions that Boris has been facilitating, which I think is probably going to be the pronounced difference. And I also think it's going to be the first thing that's going to drive these rifts. I also think that it's probably going to be in the area of strongest disagreement, at least. And then the second rift is going to come later in the government. Will be a rift in economics, which is a rift in the response to how the economical damage of the coronavirus was. Boris's approach was mostly Keynesian, which is going to eventually come to bite him in the ass, since half his party are Thatcherites. So essentially, Labour is united and semi-competent, and the Tories are divided and incompetent, and the Lib Dems exist and aren't dumb, which results in a small but substantial majority for the Labour Party. I see 8-seat majority at most. An 8-seat majority at most. I don't think that this is a particularly likely scenario. I just don't think it's impossible considering how far off we are from the election. But in this scenario, literally everything has to go right for the Labour Party and wrong for the Conservatives, for this or something similar like it to happen. So let's just start off with COVID. So obviously this scenario has a pretty stringent lockdown that results in a rift between the Conservatives and Reform, basically bludgeoning the Tories on that lockdown, saying that they that again, it wasn't justified. They're siding with the rift of the Conservatives. And the lockdown's ineffectiveness in this scenario, actually stopping the spread of COVID, would and a more right-wing version of the economics and social policy being promoted by the Reform Party will easily chip away at an unpopular and incompetent Conservative government, maybe even rising to the levels of the SCP in 1983 if they're lucky. It's also pretty likely that in a scenario like this, the economy has just been yeeted off a cliff by the Conservatives, with the initial shock of a stringent lockdown feeding into a recession that's induced by the financial sector basically throwing all of the bankers out of London. It's also probably certain that this type of repudiation of the Tories, there are going to be a lot of U-turns and a lot of scandals. I think there's also a good chance that because of one of these scandals that Boris Johnson resigns as Conservative Party leader or is ousted by the Conservative Party, especially if the polls foresee an imminent defeat, and if the Reform Party takes the hard right vote in the Midlands and Eastern England. That might spur some action from backbenchers who are at risk of losing their seat. And I think that ultimately, if something like that did happen, it wouldn't really help in the North or Midlands. Like if Boris Johnson was removed as Conservative Party leader, I don't think it would help boost their popularity, because their popularity is tied to their record in government, not necessarily to Boris Johnson, and they're always going to be tainted by Johnson, so it's useless. And I think that ultimately, if something like that did happen, it wouldn't really help them, and they gain some ascetic gains from Labour reform and really sacrifice some popularity with some more moderate voters. I also think that it's pretty obvious that the liberal Democrats are able to be quite popular in this scenario, taking up the space between Labour and the Conservatives and fighting for membership or closer ties with the EU, which I think, as in most scenarios, would be a relatively popular stance in an economic recession caused by Conservative incompetence and Brexit. I also think that for the same reasons above, the south of England is basically run amok by Lib Dems, and the Conservatives are basically brought back to 2005 levels of support in the south, and the Lib Dems get something close to 40 or 50 seats. Taking a look at the Scottish nationalists and Welsh nationalists, I think that really the only way for Labour to have an 180 seat majority, they're going to have some Scottish seats. So I think that the only way for that to happen is as a second independence referendum in Scotland, where independence is soundly rejected by the Scottish people again, and the SNP become less and less popular over time as their message of populism and independence becomes less and less in the Overton window of Scottish politics, which I think could easily push a dozen or so seats to Labour on the Clyde side. Similarly, the Welsh nationalists become less popular because of the failed go at independence in Scotland. There's been a lot of evidence that Welsh nationalism is strongly tied to Scottish nationalism for some reason. I don't know why the Welsh give a fuck about Scotland. I certainly don't. I don't care about either of them, actually. So essentially, the Lib Dems are able to take the centre and the centre right, with the Conservatives holding onto the right wing and Reform taking the far right and some of the right. And Labour takes the centre left to far left and is able to quell nationalist sentiments in the second Scottish independence referendum. So the left unites around the Labour Party, and the Conservative votes are split between moderate Lib Dems, moderates voting for the Lib Dems, and extremists voting for the Reform Party, with those stuck in between voting for the Conservatives. This is the first video I've ever made, so bear with me if I'm a bit of an idiot here. I hope you enjoy it. I've put what I think the odds are of the scenario happening, the odds of these scenarios in the description, as well as a link to the YapMS maps there, which is yet another political map simulator, I think. That's off the top of my head, so that could be extremely wrong. I hope at least one of you enjoyed that, because it took way too much time for what it is. If you like this video, then like it. If you don't, then post thousands of comments about how I don't know anything about politics. I hope you have a good time, and it was great having you here.